Hello, July here with part 3 of the video series about the impact that the release of the Grand Exchange had on the game. If you haven't watched part 1 or 2 yet, then please go do that right now, because in part 3 we will continue where we ended in part 2, and there will be several references to or a certain overlap with parts 1 and 2 as well. In part 3, we are going to have a closer look at how the release of the Grand Exchange affected merchanting and the high score competition. So merchanting is something of all times. It has existed since the early days of RuneScape. Quite simply explained, merchanting is the act of buying an item and selling it at a higher price in order to make profit. With the Grand Exchange being an automated trading process, also merchanting became somewhat automated and would suddenly require much less manual input from the players than it did before the Grand Exchange existed. This is an extremely important fact because it led to the Grand Exchange becoming an efficient money-making tool for the most proficient merchants. The traditional merchants soon realized that merchanting would from now on take place in the Grand Exchange, with perhaps the rare items as exception, and they at first weren't too pleased with that, because the fact that a market value or guide price would now be automatically provided made it easier for everyone else, while making it more difficult for the merchants to find a good deal. A remarkable trend that was visible in 2008 and later is that the top players could suddenly afford to switch from the less expensive buyable skills such as cooking and fire making to training the more expensive ones like crafting and prayer. And that was not a coincidence, it was a logical consequence of how the Grand Exchange had unintentionally introduced a more or less automated and passive money-making method. The release of the Grand Exchange caused the growth of the economy to accelerate because more trades could be conducted in a shorter period of time. You know, it was really like the game of supply and demand had suddenly been put on steroids, and it was mind-blowing to see how popular even the most expensive buyable skills became in a relatively short period of time, and today we can see the direct consequences of that. Remove the Grand Exchange from the game's entire history, and you can be sure that all of the top players would have a lot less total XP than they do today. And I actually made a chart that supports that claim, just have a look. So this chart displays the highest amount of total XP owned by a single player, and that's since the release of the game in 2001. Each circle or dot represents a locked data point. It is worth mentioning that the data points in this chart do not necessarily coincide with whoever held overall rank 1 at that moment. Most of the time, the person with rank 1 was also the person with the highest XP, but that was not always the case. For example, the Grand Exchange was released in November of 2007. As we have already discussed, this revolutionized skilling in several ways. The one that is the most relevant for this chart is that rich players could suddenly buy a lot more resources in a limited amount of time. As a consequence, you would expect that the average monthly XP gained by the players on the front page of the high scores should increase, and that is what happened in 2008 in comparison to 2007, although the chart doesn't indicate that. I will quickly add a mysterious red line here, and then we move on. Zedzima lost his rank 1 after the release of Summoning in January of 2008, and then started to play less and less. However, for almost a year after that, he was still the person with the highest XP, because it took the other people who actually did hold rank 1 a long time to catch up with Zedzima's total XP. Even with such slow XP gains compared to 2007, Zedzima was still the person with the highest XP in the game, because King Duffy, Yogo-san and Gert needed almost a year to catch up, which they did at a much faster pace than Zedzima's back in 2007. For example, in 2008, Gert gained almost 100 million XP in just a month, and that is a much faster rate than Zedzima's in 2007, but that is not visible in the chart. To fully demonstrate the effect that the Grand Exchange had, we should add the XP line of Gert, who would eventually become the new long-term rank 1, and that's what that mysterious red line is for. Here you can clearly see how the speed after the release of the Grand Exchange was a lot higher than the speed of before its release, and that's not only because resources became a lot more accessible, but also because merchanting did and could now be combined with skilling while skilling. These high-level skillers on the front page of the high scores realized and knew that they had to begin merchanting. In fact, as of later in 2008, it kind of became a requirement to start merchanting if you wanted to compete at the top of the high scores, because the increased accessibility to merchanting had led to the top players switching to the more expensive and much faster buyable skills such as construction or prayer. Some of those top players would even get actively involved in merchanting clans. The red line of Gurdjars is mainly the result of being able to efficiently combine merchanting with skilling, which wasn't really possible before the release of the Grand Exchange. So what we should learn here is that the way in which the Grand Exchange affected merchanting had a huge effect on the high score competition, allowing XP rates that are much higher than in the pre-Grand Exchange era. With all these big changes, there were several people who didn't like that, especially the traditional merchants, and even though their criticism might be valid, the conclusion of this video series is that if you want to be objective, then you have no choice but to conclude that the release of the Grand Exchange was one of the best updates ever, and that's for several reasons. It made scamming impossible, in the Grand Exchange at least. It became a huge time saver by making trading a lot more convenient. It made skilling more accessible, and it boosted the economy by allowing more trades in less amount of time. Altogether, the release of the Grand Exchange marked the beginning of a new era for skilling, which actually purely coincidentally happened to coincide with the removal of wilderness PvP, which led to the demise of PvP and the subsequent increased popularity of skilling. I will admit that I sometimes do miss face-to-face trading, but in the end, the game and the community are better off without it. The mere fact that the Grand Exchange successfully reduced scamming should already be a good enough reason for that. So that was my video series about how the Grand Exchange transformed RuneScape. I hope that you liked it. Please let me know in the comments. I also invite you to subscribe here or to follow me on my social media pages for more videos. Thank you for watching. I am July, and I hope that you will come back for more.